Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss in Internet Shitlords. And today, before I get to the main point of the video, I have some very exciting news, which is that as of this week, we've finally come out with World of the Last Sun from Spectre Press. And this is, in addition to the Old School Companion and Star Adventure, you can now get World of the Last Sun. It's a compilation volume of some of the issues of RPG Pundit Presents that is all put together. So you might have already gotten some of these. If you've gotten some of the Gonzo issues of RPG Pundit Presents, you might have some of the material in World of the Last Sun. But this is going to now be available for you, all put together and in print, in soft cover like the Old School Companion is, but also in hardcover. And the World of the Last Sun is a weird fantasy, Gonzo style fantasy RPG setting, similar to, well, you know, the weirder fantasy elements of D&D, of traditional Gonzo adventuring. The World of the Last Sun is based on my very lengthy, almost 8 year long DCC campaign, which is part of what I'm going to be talking about today. And it's the world I designed for that game. And so you'll see in World of the Last Sun, you'll get a complete guide to kind of that world and various locations in it. It's a vast world because it's basically a kind of Dyson sphere that was created by these super powerful dudes called the Ancients to save themselves from the destruction of their universe. And it has very strange combinations because of the history of this, the whole story of the World of the Last Sun. It's got a mix of many different locations, incredible amounts of weirdness, but everything ranging from like totally primitive areas to medieval type places to places that are really almost science fiction parts, right? There's, you know, like a kind of a starbase on it, which is Fox Station Aleph. And in the book, you're going to get location guides, you're going to get random tables, you're going to get a generation system for types of locations, several actually, depending on different areas. You're going to get random tables for characters. You're going to get a complete system of aerial combat with sky ships or high-tech flying vehicles. There's a complete collection of drugs and magical drugs, some other items of similar natures, and yeah, just basically a ton of material that you can use. So you can play the world in whole, or you could just cannibalize the book for parts to put into your own, you know, weird elements into your own fantasy campaign, whatever it is. And it's pretty much, well, it's OSR, but it's pretty much system neutral. So you can use it in any OSR D&D variant, or a lot of it you can use in any tabletop fantasy RPG. So be sure to check it out. The link is going to be in the description below. It's available from Drive-Thru RPG in PDF, softcover, and hardcover. And yeah, I trust that you're going to like it. It's already getting very good reviews. Had a lot of early sales from people that were obviously waiting for it. So I'm very glad that Spectre managed to bring it out before the end of the year. As far as my video today, I'm talking about something kind of related in a way, because as I mentioned, the World of the Last Sun is this very complex setting because it's a setting that I've been building up over the course of the last 8 years in my DCC campaign. Every 2 weeks for the last 8 years, our group has been coming together and playing this campaign. Now, some of you might have played very long campaigns. Now, I'll note, it's not actually technically the longest campaign that I've ever played in. The longest one I've ever played in has gotten to 10 years. Though I wouldn't be surprised if this one ends up beating it, because it's not only 8 years old, or almost, it's about to be 8 years old in a very little bit. It's 8 years old and it's still running just as strong, if not more so, than it was, 4 years ago. It's showing no signs of wear and tear. There's still always new weird stuff to happen and new weird places to discover. They've been to like all kinds of areas, but there's still more to do. And in any case, that longer campaign that I played was much earlier. It was the campaign I played, as a kid. You could say I started it I think, just before high school, and I finished it when I was finishing university, right? So it was, it's something that was a game I played with my school buddies, and a lot of the same people played the whole time. But it's something I think that's very easy to do only if you're very young and you're kind of, you've got your little group of friends and they all game and they all want to keep gaming. And so we kept gaming for a really long time. And then eventually, when we were getting to the end of our university years, people started going off in different directions. I mean, some of them weren't in university even at that point, but in any case, it started to become harder to keep it together, and then it ended, right? So there might be some of you that are playing right now, or that have played in the past, very long campaigns with a very close-knit group of friends. And if you've got that, I mean, if you've been playing the last 20 years with your buddies on a regular basis, then that's great. It's really wonderful. But it's also not that hard to do, because what's really going on is just the social bond that is keeping it together. What I'm talking about, though, is beyond that. Let's say you're now an adult and you're a gamer, you know other gamers, but it's not that you're gaming with your friends. You're looking to game with other gamers and to be able to maintain a stable and solid campaign. Obviously, sometimes you might not have players where you are that can do that, but let's assume that you do. Here where I am, there's several hundred people that are gamers, and they're very eager gamers, and so there's no lack of people. But even so, most people's campaigns don't make it to a year, much less 8 years. And I think that's probably true in most places. So I'm going to talk about a few things that for some of you might seem like old hat. It might be stuff you already know, but some other people here might get the benefit of this advice as a way to see how you can build up a long-term campaign. And again, the reason I think this is important, if you've seen my other videos, you know why. It's because it takes time to maximize the quality of the RPG experience. When you're starting the game, your character is just a character and the world is just a world. It doesn't matter how much backstory you try to make up to stuff into it, it's still not real. It only becomes real. It only gets that sense of immersion and of the emulation of a living virtual world by playing in it. And you don't really get there until you've been playing in it for at least a couple of years. If you make it to about 2 years, then you suddenly see that the world takes on a life of its own. There's stuff happening in it that if you're the DM, you don't expect or you didn't plan to happen that way, but it does, right? And if you're the player, your character stops being just someone you made up in your head or just a version of you or something like that. And instead it becomes a living character where you start not deciding what would the character do. You just know what the character would do, and they're different from you, right? It's not what you would do, it's what the character would do. So then you've suddenly incarnated this person in this living world that isn't here, right? So it's this is I think the peak RPG experience, and I want everyone to have a chance to experience it. So my main points of advice, and this is probably going to be a briefer video than usual because there's only so many things I can really say about it in overview. Maybe later on, if people are interested, I'll talk about specific parts. And if you've had a very long campaign, then talk about it in the comments if you agree with me, if there are other things that you think I missed out on that are just as important. Tell me what you think. Anyway, and I think that first and foremost, in order to be able to play a long RPG campaign, you have to be able to have a relatively organized life, right? You can't be a walking disaster of a human being and expect to be able to have a long-term campaign, because one of the things that makes for a long-term campaign to work is consistency. So if if you're going in and out of jobs, if your life isn't together, I don't know, if you're hooked on dope, son, or whatever it is, and you can't organize yourself enough to get it together, then obviously that's the first, and until it's dealt with, insurmountable hurdle to being able to run an effective campaign. Likewise, obviously, you're going to want to have people around you that are relatively together, right? The reason campaigns fall apart is not usually, I mean, sometimes it can happen that it's because people lose all interest, right? I mean, you could have a bad DM, but we're going to assume that you're not a bad DM. Or people get into a fight. But the main reason, the most common reason why a campaign doesn't last long enough to reach that peak experience is because the people involved aren't able to effectively commit to it. So if you yourself, let's say you're the DM, you're the one putting together this campaign, can't consistently commit to running a certain amount of hours of gaming at the same time every certain period of time, be it every week or every 2 weeks or once a month or whatever, but where you're consistently able to appear for that and you're consistently able to be prepared for that session, then you're going to have a big problem. So there's not much I can advise you on that, except I don't know, to go read 12 Rules for Life or something. That's apparently helped a lot of people. But sort yourself out, man. That's what you've got to do. That's step one. Now, let's say you've done that, or that you've already done that in the past, right? The next thing is you've got to get a group of people who will play. But here's the thing. If you're talking about a really long-term campaign, it'll be very, very tough especially when you're dealing with adults. The likelihood that you'll be able to get, again, people who not necessarily are your good friends, but even your good friends would have this problem, it's likely, to get a group of people where you're going to have all the same group 8 years later. That's not necessarily going to be a viable thing to happen. What you want to have, I think that the campaigns that are the most viable for long-term play are campaigns where you have a core group of people. Let's say if you've got 6 players, if 3 of those players are people that you know are going to be there every single time and that you can reasonably expect will keep playing for a reasonable amount of time, then that's going to be a very stable campaign. Even if the other 3 are not as reliable, right? But if you can say, okay, this is the type of game where we will continue to play as long as there's a minimum number of players, let's say 4 out of 6, then the session happens. And it happens no matter what. And this is an important part. You have to show a certain level of firmness about this. You have to expect that, make it clear to your players that you expect that from the beginning, and you have to be firm about it, whatever the number is, right? For me, the number is usually 3, because I usually have 4 to 7 players in a campaign. And inevitably, I find that there's a change in the sort of social dynamic of the experience when there are 3 players. That if there are 2 or there's only 1 player, it's just not happening. There isn't enough there to be a party, right? Two is a pair, and one's just a guy playing with himself. So if you got 3, though, that's a party. You could already have a group that'll be operating from 3. So what I tell my players in my campaigns, and this isn't the only one that's lasted a long time, I've had a ton of campaigns these last 30 years that have lasted between 5 to 6, 7 years each, right? And so I tell them that this is going to happen. We're playing for sure if there's a minimum of 3 players committed. And you have to kind of try to check up on them. And it might depend. Your party might become such a well-oiled machine that the people you can just count without even having to remind them or ask them or anything, that they're going to show up on that night and you're not going to have a problem. But if you're not sure about that, what you want to do is set up some kind of a group on, I don't know, on Discord, on WhatsApp, or whatever the kids are using these days. And just remind people the day before a session, hey, we're playing. Are you coming? Yes or no, right? And get the list. And if you've got 3 people that say yes, then you're playing. And you make yourself consistent about that, and you get them to be consistent about it. From my original group of my DCC campaign that became the Last Sun campaign, there's only 1 player that is still playing today from that original party. And that's Bill the Elf's character. And by the way, if you look on Bill the Elf's channel on YouTube, do a search for Bill the Elf YouTube or Bill the Elf DCC, you'll probably find it. He's now posting audio tracks of our campaign, of our games, every week that he shows up. But we always had, at any point in the campaign, a group of 3 or 4 players who I knew were really dedicated at that time to consistently arrive. Some of them later left the group, but then other players were found who had that same level of consistency. You've got to be very kind of picky not to bring in players, or not too many players, who are flaky. You have to have the core group. And right now, there is a core group there. It's, the key of the core group right now is basically Bill the Elf, the player who formerly played Heidi, and the Cat Boy, now known as the Boy Boy. Right? Those three characters, they're players. The player who formerly played Heidi is now playing the Nudist Wizard. But anyways, that all those names already tell you a little bit about what World of the Last Sun is like. Those players, I know that they will always show up, right? The only time that Bill the Elf hasn't come to a session has been when he's not been in the country, right? And it's the same with the other guys. As a rule, they're very, very consistent. And then we have a group of other players around them, including one guy that, for example, was there at almost the beginning of the campaign and has now started coming back to the game. He had like a 5-year gap, but now is playing consistently again. Who's the Rainbow Warrior now in the campaign, if you're keeping track. So people might come and go, but if you've got a core group that is stable, you can keep them together. And if that group remains, if you don't get too many people coming or going too fast, then there will also be a continuity in the storyline, right? Like that, and by storyline I don't mean what you're planning, but in the sense that the players will feel that the world is known to them, because the other players who've been there longer will do exposition on things that they've already seen. The newer players will pick up on that, and there's like a legacy of it going on, right? So I think those are actually two of the most important things you can do to have a stable campaign. It's important also that the campaign be one where you are able to adapt to unexpected changes in attendance, right? In the Last Sun campaign, we basically play, if somebody doesn't show up, they don't show up that session, we find an excuse for them to show up later. And that's part of it is because it is kind of a gonzo world and it's weird, and you can usually figure something out. But you might have to have other precautions about that in more serious minded types of campaigns. You want to have the opportunity for the player characters to develop their characters, but you also wanted to have, obviously, the sense of verisimilitude that includes the idea that you're not having a story told to you, right? And the idea that your character can easily die. And, in DCC, those of you who played DCC, characters can easily die. And one of the things that has kept the game from becoming boring is that even very high-level characters can die. Heidi was an incredibly powerful warrior in the campaign. He died, right? This is something that can still happen. I think, ironically, one of the pieces of advice I'd give is be wary of playing straight D&D high level, because at that point you find that sometimes the levels of challenges become boring, and it's too easy to be revived if you die, so there's the level of risk goes down. You have to keep up the level of challenge and keep up the level of risk and keep up the level of discovery. And this is tying into what I was saying about story, that you don't need to tell a story for the campaign. What you need is to have the characters discover the world through exploration and through kind of adventures, right? It's perfectly fine to set up adventure hooks for them that they may take or they may not. And some of the most interesting things in the campaign have happened because I wasn't rigidly trying to control what went on. Sometimes there'd be an adventure hook for something going on in a certain place, I don't know, the zombie empire, and the characters were like, no, screw that, right? We're going to the shithole. And they went off to the shithole, which are both actual places that you can read about in World of the Last Sun. They're both in there, complete with lots of interesting details and random tables. And the fact that I wasn't trying to create NPCs that were vital to a storyline, but I created lots of interesting NPCs, it meant that it also wasn't something where the player characters were being led along by the nose, or where they had to be forced to interact with certain NPCs to move my plot along, right? So this is long-term campaigns depend on there not being long-term intricate plots. In fact, in my experience, the more I was dependent on having great overarching plots. I'm not talking about playing single adventures where there's kind of a plot to the adventure. That's usually okay. But where I'm trying to get to some great story arc, that ends up failing a lot because it becomes an ever more evident case of the players finding themselves thwarted by the need of the story to manifest, right? So a much better way is to look at the campaign as a gazetteer, that is a sandbox. Your characters can go lots of different places and you have lots of different things going on. And then you think as the DM about what are the consequences of the things they've done or the things they haven't been doing. So if there's like some, evil power group somewhere, like, the Halcon Lords, which are a bad, well, they're a dangerous cult, I guess you could say, in the World of the Last Sun. You can read about them in the book. And the player characters have just been ignoring those guys, then those guys are going to potentially become more powerful, become a bigger threat, and then the player characters will have to deal with them when they're a bigger threat, or something like that. But this is different from, kind of forcing them by the nose to go and deal with them at a certain point, and then they're not allowed to kill the main bad guy because you need him for later on in your planned campaign. You see what I mean? You can also create a chronology of your world. I don't do that in World of the Last Sun, where I'm basically going by the seat of my pants, and I've usually only got like 3 sessions ahead planned in terms of things that'll happen in the world. But in, for example, Dark Albion, I obviously have a 30-year chronology, which is the chronology of the 30 Years' War. And there are all these events that are bound to take place year by year. But then in that campaign, which by the way lasted well over 6 years, the original Dark Albion campaign, I would leave it up to the players, to what extent they were going to follow along with the vital events that take place in the chronology. There were some things where they were right in the middle of it, some epic moments where they were, directly involved in the historical events, and then other moments where they were like, no, we're going to be over here somewhere, right? And that's a big part of what allows the world to gain more verisimilitude and to become and to feel more genuine. So I think those are some very important points. You need to let these places develop and let the NPCs, you can create lots of interesting NPCs, but you don't want to force any of them on the characters. And it's been very well proven in my last Sun game, because there are some characters, some NPCs that are fairly significant in the world that the player characters have interacted with very little, or don't care that much about. And then there were, because I wasn't trying to force one way or the other, there were characters that were meant to just like be a dude that's there for one scene, for one moment where they're in a place. And the players are like, oh yeah, this guy's coming with us, right? So that's how they ended up with like, Bork the meek orc, who sadly passed away in this latest session, but he was hilarious. And he wasn't a guy I'd really like planned out ahead of time to be a member of their party. They just kind of took him on board, right? The most famous of these being Lenny the Saint, who started out as a guy I was pretty sure they were going to kill really quickly because he was secretly a cannibal, right? But instead they kind of took a liking to him, got him to promise not to eat them, and took him along for the ride. So these are things that can happen when you're not trying to dominate a storyline, right? So I guess my most fundamental points are, heads and tails above everything else, without question, the main thing you have to have a long campaign is to have stability. It's stuff that has nothing to do with the campaign itself. It has to do with with you being stable and with having a stable group of players that will consistently participate. Part of it is that those players will come and go, and then you will also have to have ways to integrate new people in. At a second tier, you need to have a world that feels open enough to get an organic sense of its own reality, and where your players can feel free enough that they can develop themselves in any way that they want to. And at kind of a similar, let's say a third tier, but pretty close to the second, you want to have a game system that maintains a level of adventurousness and risk in spite of a game having gone on for a long time. One of the easiest ways long-term campaigns get boring and die is that the player characters are already too powerful and have dealt with everything, right? So if you're playing a game where you know that characters will get progressively more powerful, and you want to have a long-term campaign, don't rush, right? Take it slow. But beyond that, try to make sure you have a game world and ideally a game system where high-level characters are not, impossible to challenge. If there's no challenge and there's no risk, the game will get boring. And the way campaigns will end is either by a failure in the infrastructure of how they're when they meet and how often they meet, or because the campaign gets boring. Those are the two biggest cases. So anyways, that's my advice, my key advice. There's probably a lot more I could say about this, but I see I've already spoken longer than I thought I would. Feel free to share this video anywhere you like. Please like the video and subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. We're now past 3,000 subscribers. Let's see if we can get to 5. And if you like my work, if you've been sharing some of my more controversial videos than this one in places that has burned a few people's singed a few people's hairs, that's fine by me. And if you want to encourage me to keep either writing my games, doing these videos, and fighting the fight that I'm fighting, then you could support me. If you wanted to, you could just toss money at me. I have a PayPal link, and I also have a Patreon. I actually got a new Patreon person who sent me, and thank you very much. I really appreciate it, to the person who just did a $5 Patreon. That's lovely. I really appreciate it. I do. But I do think that the best way to support me is by purchasing my products, right? So books, my games like Star Adventure and Lion and Dragon, and there's Lion and Dragon and the Old School Companion. And also, of course, my brand new World of the Last Sun book. And keep an eye out later for more RPG Pundit Presents. If you haven't checked any of those out, check them out. They're still, the vast majority of them are not in compilation volumes. So there's still all the Last Sun adventures, and all the Last Sun source book material is still not in the stuff, and the the Lion and Dragon adventures and all of the later Lion and Dragon setting material are not in it. So check all those out. RPG Pundit Presents are all PDF books that you can buy for between $1 and $5, and so it's like you're buying me a coffee or something, but you're also getting something for yourself. Buying my books, I believe in my books. I think that my books are going to be useful to you if you're a gamer, especially if you're an OSR gamer. And, depending on your tastes, you might like serious medieval authentic stuff, like what you see in the Old School Companion and Lion and Dragon, or you might like, more weird fantasy and gonzo stuff like you're going to see in the World of the Last Sun. But there's that, and everything in between is in my products, so you're going to find something you like. And that's a great way to support me. Besides that, though, if you don't have $1 to your name right now, and I know that there's some people who don't, so we sympathize with you. A good way to help is also to hit the like button, subscribe, and share this video. Anyways, we'll talk to you all soon. I hope you all had a Merry Christmas, and I hope you all have a great New Year, because I don't think I'll be doing another video before the New Year. But have a very happy New Year. Currently smoking Neerup, a bent apple, and Argento Latakia.